To today's lecture on value-based norms as foundation for the pursuit of health in global solidarity. I am Liao Xuexia, Assistant Professor of Peking Law School. Today we are very pleased to have invited Professor Otto Spijkers to give this lecture. Professor Otto Spijkers is Professor of International Law at Wuhan University's China Institute of Boundary and Ocean Studies, as well as its Research Institute of Environmental Law. He is also a founding staff of its International Water Law Academy. He is managing editor of the Chinese Journal of Environmental Law. Before joining Wuhan University, he worked at the Guterres Center for Water, Oceans and Sustainability Law and the Netherlands Institute for the Law of the Sea. He was visiting lecturer at various institutions, including Xiamen University's China International Water Law Program. He wrote his doctoral dissertation entitled "The United Nations: The Evolution of Global Values and International Law" at the Groschel Center for International Legal Studies of Leiden University. Today's lecture is based on Professor Otto Spijkers' contribution to the research project on epidemics and international law, a research project led by Professor Xinyang Marase through the Hague Academy of International Law. And this book will be forthcoming later this year. Today we're also very honored to have two discussants with us. This is Professor Qin Xuezhen from the School of Economics of Peking University. Professor Qin is an expert in health economics. His primary research interests include health economics, economics of human capital, and applied econometrics. And this is Professor Chen from Peking Law School. Professor Chen's research focuses on international law theories, international organizations, and the history of international law. I am sure that the participation of these two distinguished discussants would contribute to bringing about an interdisciplinary dialogue tonight. For our event today, Professor Otto Spijkers will speak for around 40 minutes. Thereafter, Professor Qin and Professor Chen will each make comments for about 10 to 15 minutes. Afterward, the floor will be open for questions or comments from the audience. So now, okay, please, you have the floor.
Okay. Thanks very much. And you always forget to mention that we actually met each other in Utrecht because Xuexia did a guest researchship at the Netherlands Institute for the Law of the Sea, and that's where we met. So I'm very pleased to see you again, and it also shows us how small this world actually is. So yes, I'm going to speak on value-based norms as a foundation for the pursuit of health in global solidarity, and this is indeed based on a research I did under the auspices of Xinyang Marase for the Hague Academy of International Law. And this book, an edited volume, will be published later this year. So let me begin with a quote. "A crisis is a terrible time to predict the future," wrote Simon Chesterman in the Straits Times of May 2020. But at the level of the global legal order, it's also the only time we can bring about serious change. So the League of Nations would not have been created without the First World War. The United Nations was a byproduct of the second, end of quote. And he appears to be suggesting, let's see what changes this COVID crisis will bring to the United Nations and the global order. So Chesterman is basically making 2 points, which are sort of the starting point of my lecture. First, that a crisis is a terrible time to predict the future and to make policy. And what I always teach my students is that exceptional cases make bad law. And that is sort of a traditional thing to say to your students. But second, a crisis has also always proved in the past to be very fertile ground for change. So there's this contradiction here. Yeah, and indeed, what is then the challenge I want to address together with you this evening? So a crisis is a litmus test for the international community, and we are definitely facing a crisis now. So the main assumption of my presentation is that fighting the virus, the coronavirus, can be actually a good opportunity to demonstrate our lasting global solidarity in the fight against a common enemy, with a central role for the United Nations. And my argument is based on the assumption that the United Nations has actually been doing this since its very establishment. And so this call for global solidarity to fight a common enemy is nothing new, I would argue. It's basically what the UN has been doing since 1945. The UN has always used principles and norms of international law based on globally shared values as a legal basis for efforts to tackle global evils and promote global goods and values, and to do so in global solidarity. So this fight against corona is just the next chapter in that story. So in the next, the remainder of my presentation, I will first say a little bit more about what global values are and what the values-based global order entails. And then I will look at the central role of the United Nations in that value-based order. And then, of course, I will quickly turn to corona. And what I'm saying is nothing new here. You see the United Nations General Assembly calling for global solidarity to fight the coronavirus disease. So I'm not the only one calling for global solidarity. But let me begin at the start. So what are global values? And I'm not going to bore you too much with philosophy, don't worry. But global values, you could describe them as globally shared beliefs that the world is lacking something and that there is something we can do to fix it, to fix the world. So the global values describe an achievable, a real alternative. So I will now look at some characteristics of global values that sort of make it easier for you to get a grip of this term. So global values are not facts, they are beliefs. And because they are beliefs, they only come to the surface through global conversation. It's not as if you can find values hidden in a cave somewhere, like this shiny diamond that was discovered somewhere hidden for us to unveil. That's not how values are found. Also, the pursuit of global values is based on a belief in progress, and that is also the controversial aspect of values. So attempts to define global values, globally shared beliefs in a better world, are based on this idea that we are constantly making progress, that world history is about progress, but that there will always be something to improve, so we'll never get to the perfect world. What I find interesting is that it's usually the younger generation that can point out what we are doing wrong. And this cartoon nicely depicts that. So what do cows do most of the time? Does anyone have an idea? What do cows do?
Eating grass?
Yes, they eat grass. So most cows, they spend basically their entire life eating grass. And then you see this bovine, this young cow on the top right of the cartoon, lifting up its head and exclaiming, "Hey, wait a minute, this is grass. We've been eating grass." As if to say, isn't there something better we can do with our lives? And the idea of this cartoon is that it's very hard to question your sort of culture and traditions, but that for the younger generation it's much easier to do so. Third aspect of global values is that they should describe a better world, but not a perfect world. So they serve in a way like the carrot that you hold in front of the donkey's nose, urging it to move forward. So if the values are too utopian, if they're impossible to actually realize, i.e. if you hold the carrot too far away from the donkey's nose, the donkey will just give up chasing the carrot. It will say, okay, I'll never get to the carrot, forget the carrot. So that's not going to work. That's not going to urge the donkey to move forward. But if you move the carrot too close to the donkey's nose, so if the values are too easy to realize, then the donkey will just grab the carrot and eat it and also stop moving forward. So you have to find a way in between those two extremes to ensure that the donkey will keep going forward, but it will also never achieve its goal. That's a bit how values work. And finally, of course, we have to make sure that our global values indeed describe a better world and do not lead us into the abyss, as you can see in this cartoon. So we need to constantly question and revisit our values and examine them critically. It's often said that this pursuit of a better world is like a Sisyphean task. That's a reference to the myth of Sisyphus. I'm sure you all know it, but it's this guy who was condemned by the Greek gods to push a boulder up a mountain, and every time he got almost to the top of the mountain, the boulder would just drop back, and he had to start all over again. And he's still doing this because he was condemned to do this for eternity, and he has eternal life, so he will do this forever and ever and ever. So is trying to make the world better a Sisyphean task? Is it worth all the trouble to make the world better? I mean, do we actually make progress? It certainly seems so. So we have eliminated slavery, colonialism, we have prohibited war as a means to settle international disputes. So isn't that progress? Or is making the world better a task that we will never accomplish and that we better just give up on? It seems that once we have eliminated an old evil, a new one emerges and we're in trouble again. So now we're fighting climate change and the coronavirus. And once we have beaten those, I'm sure there will be another challenge that we have to meet. So how do we actually define these values? How do we find an alternative to the current world? Well, the easiest way to define or find our values is when there is an obvious lack in this world. So global values manifest themselves best when the current world is obviously lacking something. And then we think of a better alternative. So an alternative that is better, but is also an achievable alternative. So what is this? It's war. It's two tanks. So it's fighting, it's war. So what would be the alternative to war?
Lawsuit.
Sorry?
Like bring something to the court, like lawsuits.
No, you are thinking just, maybe it's better not to think. So, opposite of war.
Peace.
Peace, exactly. Peace. Peace on earth. Alternative to environmental degradation, healthy environment. Alternative to sickness, health. So when there is an obvious lack in the world, it's very easy to identify, or it's a lot easier to identify the alternative that we should together strive towards. So let me now turn to the role of the United Nations in this value-based global order. And basically, I would argue that the UN contributes in three different ways. It provides the forum to identify these values. So the UN General Assembly is often referred to as the town meeting of the world. It's sort of the place where the whole world gets together to discuss problems and try to find solutions. Of course, there's a lot to say about this. So, for example, in the beginning of the United Nations, China was not well represented. That's a big problem. Another problem is that some people still are not adequately represented. But it's sort of the best thing that we have at the moment. Second, I believe that the UN is quite well at promoting the joint realization of these values. And third, the UN is quite okay at promoting global solidarity. One thing the UN is not good at, and I will say a bit more about that in a minute, is about enforcing compliance with these values or with the norms that are based on it. So people always expect of the UN Security Council or the UN more generally to be the enforcer of international legal order, but that's something the UN cannot do and should not be expected to do. But the UN is good at providing this sort of forum for discussion. So in my doctoral research, and Shwesha kindly referred to it, I actually looked at the travaux préparatoires of the United Nations Charter, so its founding history. So that began with a meeting of Churchill and Roosevelt on an aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean, where they concluded the Atlantic Charter. Then some other countries, including the Netherlands, they joined in this project, and then slowly the United Nations was established. This whole process culminated in the San Francisco Conference that took place in San Francisco at the end of the war. And of course, San Francisco was not very much affected by the war. Basically, there was no fighting in San Francisco, so it all looks very nice and neat. But at that time, Europe was in complete ruins. And at that time, the UN Charter was concluded. I think Ilko van Kleffens, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, and at the time the Netherlands delegate to the conference, he nicely made this comparison between building the UN, so to speak, and building a ship. So when, in the early summer of 1945, the UN Charter was drawn up in San Francisco, it was, said Ilko van Kleffens, like the launching of a ship which later put to the sea, laden with the hopes and aspirations for peace of the whole world, is now sailing the stormy waters she was expected to encounter. So I really like this idea that the United Nations was built on the docks, so on the dry land, and then when it was finished, it was just put to sea, but nobody knew if it would actually be able to float or immediately sink when put to sea. But the UN organization is still there, and it has been fixed a couple of times, and it has had some rough times, but it's still there. And the idea in 1945, but that's the idea still, is that people from all over the world, they sort of bring their ideas about what the world should look like to New York, and then it is included in this UN Charter. And so my brother is an illustrator of children's books, so he made this illustration for me, my little brother. And it's actually on the cover of my doctoral dissertation, so I always want to share it with everybody. So already in San Francisco in 1945, there were a lot of references to solidarity. So I just take one from the delegate leader of Mexico, a quote of 1945. So in this UN Charter are gathered all the hopes for human solidarity. Henceforth, no nation needs any longer to be isolated in silence and in darkness, in the indifference or the complicity of the rest of the world. We are now met at the forum of universal conscience. So there were, at the time, a lot of high hopes. So a lot was expected of the United Nations. It was really supposed to sort of save us from another world war. So after San Francisco, this global conversation about values continued in the UN General Assembly, the town meeting of the world, as it's often called. And actually, as we are talking to each other tonight, there is another session of the UN General Assembly, and both the president of China and the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, they have addressed the Assembly only a couple of days ago. So I wanted to quote from those speeches in a minute. But yeah, that is the global conversation that has been going on now since 1945. And it's going on, it's adding another chapter to that conversation as we speak. So Jan Pronk, a very famous and influential diplomat from the Netherlands, he also emphasized the value of the United Nations not so much as a enforcer of international law, but more as this value-based community. So he wrote, the United Nations is a value community. Through intensive and continuous international consultations, a global consensus is achieved on principles, norms, and values. The results of this conversation are laid down in charters, conventions, and resolutions. And that's indeed how it works. So first a consensus is achieved on values, then these values are translated into more concrete rights and obligations, and those rights and obligations are then laid down in international law. So treaties like the human rights treaties or the Paris Agreement, or the, well, basically every treaty you can think of has been prepared under the auspices of the United Nations. So as I said before, this is what the UN is good at. But the UN is terrible at enforcing its norms, at ensuring compliance with international law. So the UN is often compared with a paper tiger, and the same is done of international law more general. So it's a monster without teeth, or made of paper. But the question is whether that is really a bad thing. I mean, international law has always been the language of hope rather than the language of guns and power and oppression and so on. So I don't know if that's really a flaw of the international legal order, that it's so weak at ensuring compliance with its norms. So let me now, I'm about halfway, let me now turn to the health issue, so the fight against corona. So obviously health, I believe it's a global value, and there, of course it's valuable for the world population to be healthy, to be in a healthy condition. So what does that mean? Well, we don't need to know in detail what it means to be healthy, but in any case it means that we have to get rid of this deadly virus that is now circulating all around the globe, the COVID-19. So, of course, a lot of people, they call for global solidarity in the fight against corona. So this is the UN Secretary General António Guterres on the 8th of May 2020 at a meeting on racism. So he said, COVID-19 does not care who we are, where we live, what we believe, or about any other distinction, and thus we need every ounce of solidarity to tackle it together. So in a way, COVID-19 does not discriminate, but that means it's everybody's enemy. And on the 22nd of this, September of 2021, so that's only a couple of days ago, a global COVID-19 summit took place at UN headquarters in New York on ending the pandemic and building back better health security to prepare for the next. So many people, I mean, this may sound a bit cynical, but many people are already preparing for the next pandemic. So he said that, and I quote, global vaccination is not philanthropy, it is self-interest, because the larger the pool of unvaccinated people, the more the virus will keep circulating. So I will say, end of quote, I will say a bit more about this later. But since we're in China, I also wanted to quote from Xi Jinping. So this is a quote from September 2020. So that's last year, the UN General Assembly of last year. And that was actually meant to be a big party, like an anniversary of the United Nations. I think it was its 75th anniversary, so it was supposed to be a huge celebration of the UN's history and its success. But of course, because of the virus, everybody had other things on their mind. But still, many heads of state, including the Chinese, they did refer to the future of the UN and predicted it would have a bright future. So what he said is major changes unseen in a century are taking place in our world. The sudden attack of COVID-19 is a grave test for the entire world. Mankind has entered a new era of interconnectedness, with countries sharing intertwined interests and their future closely linked together. And then in later part of his speech, he spoke about the UN. And the UN must promote cooperation, and to promote cooperation among countries is a founding mission of the UN and an important purpose spelled out in the UN Charter. End of quote. So a bit like I just did, he was referring back to the history of the UN and was saying, so this is what the UN has been established for, to keep the world together in fighting these kind of common enemies. And then only a couple of days ago, at the annual meeting of this year, he basically continued on the same theme. So on COVID, he said, vaccination is our powerful weapon against COVID-19. I have stressed on many occasions the need to make vaccines a global public good. Of pressing priority is to ensure the fair and equitable distribution of vaccines globally. So what does global solidarity mean concretely? It's this, the equitable distribution of vaccines. And then on the UN, the importance of the UN, the central role of the UN in promoting this value-based order. Xi Jinping said the UN should hold high the banner of true multilateralism and serve as the central platform for countries to jointly chart the course for the future of the world. So let us work together to build a community with a shared future for mankind and a better world for all. And because I'm Dutch, I also want to refer to the Prime Minister of my country, the Netherlands, but basically he's sort of making the same arguments. So this is last year. Then Mark Rutte addressed the General Assembly. He actually did it online, so he did not go to New York last year. This year he did. So the epidemic has forced us to face facts. In times of crisis, we have to work together, look out for each other, support one another. Not just our families, neighbors and compatriots, but also other countries and peoples, regardless of the borders between us, because we're all in this together. And then only a couple of days ago, he continued on this theme. First on COVID, he said, the reality is that no one is safe until everyone is safe. You hear this from many politicians, this kind of slogan. COVID-19 will remain a threat for as long as a large part of the world is not fully vaccinated. So global solidarity, as you can see, he was literally using this term. Global solidarity is not simply the right thing to do, it's the only thing we can do to end the pandemic. And that's kind of interesting, and you hear this argument being made more and more often, that global solidarity is not the, morally speaking, the right thing to do. It's actually in our own self-interest. Because if we only focus on vaccinating our own people, then the virus will just keep circulating and we will never get rid of it. So it's actually in our self-interest to fight this virus at a global level. And then on the UN, I want to appeal to everyone here, let us not give in to cynicism and fatalism. This place, UN headquarters, this beacon of international cooperation, had proved in the past that we can find solutions together. So, like Xi Jinping and like myself, he's actually referring back to this history of the UN, this extraordinary history. By the way, don't misunderstand my words. I'm not trying to place myself on the same level as these two heads of state. I'm just saying that I agree with the statement they're making. So now I want to say a little bit about what this means concretely, because a lot of people are saying, well, those are just speeches and words, but what about action and deeds? So we do have to admit that it's much easier to speak about global solidarity and vaccine equity than to act in global solidarity and actually to ensure equitable distribution of vaccines. So most notably, the problem of vaccine nationalism, I'm sure you've heard this term, vaccine nationalism, is very real at the moment. So rich countries, they have most of the vaccines, and some countries, they are even providing or considering to provide booster jabs. I don't know if you've heard this term already, booster jabs. It's a third dose of the vaccine, but the effects of this third dose are yet uncertain. So the idea is that a third dose of the vaccine may slightly improve or prolong your immunity from the virus. So some countries are already providing these booster jabs to the most vulnerable of their population. But of course, at the same time, many people in the world are still waiting for their first dose of the vaccine. And if you just compare the effectiveness of the first dose with the effectiveness of the third dose, then obviously the first dose is crucial and the third dose is convenient. So this is often compared with somebody who is at sea, somebody with a life vest at sea, to give him or her another life vest in case the first one might break or something. But then not to give a life vest to another person who doesn't have any life vest at all and is actually drowning. I'm not sure that this comparison is entirely accurate, but okay, you get the idea. So some people are even calling this not vaccine nationalism, but vaccine apartheid. And that's a very loaded, controversial term. But that's of course the idea. That's why these people are using it. They want us to get emotional about this issue, about the unequal and unequitable distribution of vaccines at the moment. Yeah, and as many politicians note, we all know that none of us are safe from the virus until all of us are safe, and safe means vaccinated. So national group immunity does not really work when new mutations of the virus emerge elsewhere in the world. So vaccinating all the world's people is thus, as I said before, in our own self-interest. And it's not only a moral obligation, like the right thing to do, but it's also a selfish thing to do because it's the easiest way to fully get rid of the virus. So how to move forward? Well, the World Health Organization created the COVAX, the COVID Vaccine Access Program, which focuses on vaccinating the most vulnerable people in the developing world. And most vulnerable people, that's the elderly, people with illnesses, but also care workers. They should be vaccinated first. But of the pledges made to donate over 1 billion vaccines to these people, only about 15% of the vaccines have actually been delivered. So a lot of pledges have been made, but very few vaccines have yet been delivered. So if we take vaccine equity and global solidarity seriously, we need to deliver on this pledge. And also we may actually think about going even further and releasing the patents of the vaccine and allowing them to be produced all over the world, because that's still not always the case. And people, as I said a couple of minutes ago, some people are actually already starting to think about how we can do better in terms of international cooperation and solidarity in our response to the next pandemic. So they're already thinking about the next pandemic, whenever it may come. So at the World Health Assembly of 2021 in Geneva, a group of world leaders, they supported this initiative of the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, a Belgian guy, and the Director General of the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, to make a framework convention on pandemic preparedness and response. That's to make a multilateral treaty on pandemic preparedness and response, in which internationally binding commitments are made for better pandemic preparedness and response. So this is the ideal opportunity, you might think, to persuade the international community of states to translate the moral pleas for global solidarity that are now so generously being made into an obligation of global solidarity. Solidarity duties. And actually we were talking about Hague Academy of International Law. So Rudiger Wolfram, a quite famous lawyer, he gave the general course some years ago, and he focused his general course on this theme of global solidarity as a legal obligation. It's very interesting. So whether there is a obligation like a solidarity duty. That was the theme of his lectures. And also Shinya Murase, mentioned him in the introduction, in his capacity as a rapporteur on the topic of epidemics and international law, rapporteur of the Institut de Droit International. That's a sort of a gathering of distinguished experts on international law, and they produce articles. They're a bit like the International Law Commission, but the International Law Commission is affiliated with the UN, and the Institut de Droit International functions entirely independently. So they also make draft articles, and they also adopt resolutions and so on. And then they hope that the international community of states will use their work as basis for the drafting and eventual conclusion of international treaties. So Murase, as a rapporteur on the topic of epidemics, he published a report, and in it he proposed that epidemics should be considered a matter of common concern of humankind, I'm quoting, and that would then make it necessary for the international community to respond to such epidemics on the basis of, and I quote again, international solidarity and cooperation. And he actually does distinguish between international solidarity and international cooperation. It's not the same thing. So international cooperation basically means working together. It's more of a neutral term. And international solidarity means paying particular attention to the most vulnerable of the international community, and also identifying the thing that we jointly protect as a global public good, as Xi Jinping has done, or a common concern of humankind, and so on. It's something that we have to preserve and protect together, like a healthy population. And the report further stated that solidarity among nations, I'm quoting again, is the foundation in coping with the situation of epidemics. So solidarity among nations is actually at the very foundation of this new international legal regime that should be established as a response to future pandemics. And on the 4th of September of 2021, so that's very recent, the Institut de Droit International indeed adopted a set of articles on epidemics and international law. So these articles were proposed by Shinya Murase, which might assist in the preparation of a treaty on pandemic preparedness and response. And most notably, Article 7 of the articles of the Institut de Droit International, it emphasizes that the rules of international law relating to epidemics should be, and now I quote, identified, interpreted, applied, and implemented in line with the need for international solidarity and cooperation, end of quote. So the Institut de Droit International approved of Shinya Murase's proposal to really have global solidarity as the very basis, as the very foundation of this new international legal regime. So I believe that's a very promising first step towards a solidarity-based legal framework on pandemic preparedness and response. But of course, without such a new framework treaty in place, we can already demonstrate global solidarity in the fight against the current pandemic. And yeah, those of you that have listened to the speeches by Xi Jinping especially, you will know that China has pledged to donate a lot of vaccines to the developing world. And some other states have done the same. But not all states are equally generous, and not all states actually fulfill the pledges that they make. So, yeah, I think that maybe China and the Netherlands are exemplary in this sense. So the Netherlands now has this policy that for every vaccine that is provided to a Dutch national, one vaccine is distributed globally. So 1, 1, 1, 1. Yeah. But I'm not saying that my country has a perfect track record when it comes to global solidarity in fighting the coronavirus. Especially at the beginning, the focus was very much on vaccinating the Dutch nationals, so our own people. And now that most of the people in the Netherlands have received 2 doses, so have been fully vaccinated, of course it's a bit easier now to be solidar with the rest of the world. And of course, I also studied philosophy, and there are good philosophical arguments to justify why you care most about your own people and then about the rest of the world. It's a bit like a mother who cares most about the future of her own child. And of course that doesn't make her an evil person. It just means that if all mothers put their own children first, then the system works quite well. The problem is when you have some mothers that don't care about their own children, and then there's nobody to care for them. So yeah, a promising first step towards a solidarity-based legal framework is this work of the Institut de Droit International. And yeah, I think that's a valuable step to jointly promote the global value of a healthy world population. And also in these articles and in the first draft of the Framework Convention on Pandemic Preparedness and Response, there is a central role for the UN family, not necessarily the UN Security Council or General Assembly, but more other like health-related organizations or subsidiary organs or affiliated organs of the UN family. So very much central coordinating role of those institutions. Yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say.